liberalism. And as you'll see as I go through my talk, I personally don't see any reason to qualify it as classical liberalism. It's just liberalism. However, nowadays, considering what's referred to as liberal and liberalism, we use the term classical liberalism to make clear that we're referring to a certain tradition. I can tell you right off, the best single book on liberalism is written by, guess who? Ludwig von Mises. And it is called, guess what? Liberalism. He wrote it in German, and there is a new German edition with a very good introduction, very informative introduction by Professor Hoppe. However, the English version has been in print for many years now, and a rather brilliant translation, actually, that has been compared to Chapman's Homer and Reeves' Tocqueville. Now, my starting off by mentioning Mises brings to mind the remark that Professor Hoppe made in one of his talks, sort of preemptively answering the charge that we make a cult out of Ludwig von Mises. This is not true. It is true that I am personally grateful to Mises for having cured me of blindness by touching me one time. And he raised my brother-in-law from the dead. But this is not to say that we make any kind of cult. There is no question of a cult. Hilarity aside, why do we keep going back to Mises? Well, and why is the Institute named after Ludwig von Mises? Well, it is certainly not because Mises was infallible. As far as I'm concerned, there are important areas where he went down the wrong road. Maybe I'll be able to mention it at the end of my talk. In regard to democracy, for instance, you'll see in the book on liberalism, he has a section on democracy and why democracy, that is majority rule, is important and necessary. I think that he didn't take into consideration the deeper implications of modern electoral democracy. Another area where I think Mises was mistaken was in regard to natural rights. He tended to be a utilitarian in a broad-based utilitarian way, and I think did not give sufficient consideration to natural rights. So then why is it that we keep going back? Well, personally, I've found over decades now that the writings of Ludwig von Mises are a source of profound insight, continually profound insight into the workings of society. Ever since my old high school buddy, George Reisman, introduced me to human action, he must have been 16 or 17 when he read it, and ever since our days at the Mises seminar at New York University, I found Mises, I've never had to give up my opinion that he was the greatest social scientist of the 20th century and the greatest social scientist I've ever encountered. But you might think to yourself, well, isn't it odd that this person whom I'm being told was so great and so profound is virtually unknown to educated people? Well, Mises is less unknown than he was maybe 10 years ago. And the reason for that is because of the collapse of communism. It was Mises who first of all came up with the argument that economic calculation is impossible under socialism, under full socialism, and maintained that argument throughout his whole career. He was poo-pooed and ridiculed and even mocked by establishment figures, by mainstream figures, and then came as a surprise to everybody, as a surprise to Samuelson and everybody else who thought that the Soviet system was improving and was going to go on forever, came the collapse of communism. And I don't know if you know who Robert Heilbrunner is. He wrote a famous, maybe the most famous, or in America, history of economic thought, the worldly philosophers. And he wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine, a popular article, where he said, well, gee, it turns out that Mises was right. Now, Lew Rockwell wrote a column on this called A Marxoid Oops for LewRockwell.com. And this is something that you should know about. This is a tremendous resource. This is on something called the Internet. I'm quite familiar with the Internet. I mean, you might not think, given my age and so on, but I know. You switch on the computer and then things happen. And this changes every day, except on Sunday for various reasons. It doesn't. But otherwise, it's new stuff every single day. And a number of people here are contributors and also interesting stuff from the rest of the web. And while I'm at it, I might as well mention this. My other favorite website, antiwar.com, which has an enormous amount of stuff on foreign policy and international relations. Well, the point I was getting at is that you can look up the Lew Rockwell archive on his website, and he talks about how Heilbrunner finally gave Mises credit for having been right in this debate, which for decades, all, not just leftists and Marxists, but all the establishment figures said that Mises was wrong. So, Mises is somewhat better known than he was before. Still not very well known. In economics programs, is he somebody that is brought to your attention? I think not, as a general rule. But Mises is just one of those who have been important thinkers who have been blanked out. This is not an accident. It's not a conspiracy. It's just a result of the prevailing intellectual culture. But it's not an accident that you're not apt to come across Mises in your college courses. Let's take a number of the people I'm going to be mentioning, a number of the events I'm going to be mentioning in my lecture today, you've probably never heard of. And I have to just take my word for it. I'm not just inventing these people. They're not just bogus individuals and bogus revolutions and bogus developments. But let's take another example. There was a great 19th century French economist named Frédéric Bastiat. Okay, now, Bastiat also was virtually unknown in France. A good friend of mine, Henri Lepage, who is a leading French libertarian, when he was, 35 or something, some 25 years ago or so, happened to be in New York City and went to the bookshop of the Laissez-Faire Books. They had a shop in New York at the time. And he came across a little book by Bastiat called The Law that had been published by the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington. Henri Lepage, by that time, was a believer in the free market. He read and reads omnivorously. He had never heard of Bastiat. The first time he had ever heard of Bastiat was through this English language translation and this publication in the United States. Is that an accident? Is it a coincidence? Is it a conspiracy? Not a conspiracy. And Bastiat, this is the 200th anniversary of his birth, and Bastiat now is becoming a big deal, very celebrated. There was an article celebrating him in The Economist, the London journal, in the Wall Street Journal, and the Prime Minister of Italy, Signor Berlusconi, donated as a present to all of his ministers copies of the works of Bastiat. We suspect that this is probably due to the power behind the throne in Italy today, who is, of course, Alberto Mingardi, one of our participants here. So the point is, people are discovering Bastiat, but on the other hand, for decades and for generations, he was unknown. His name was well, in a sense, suppressed. And that'll be the case with other people I'll be talking about today. So the fact that your professors have never told you about any of these people, or have not told you about these particular events, does not mean that they are negligible or unimportant. Now, with the fall of communism, the importance of liberalism is becoming more obvious. It's amazing the amount of intellectual effort that was devoted to the history of socialism, to the minutiae of socialism, and especially of Marxism. And there were particular parts of Marxism, like the thought of Gramsci, that were, or Marxist humanism or something, and book after book, article after article, courses in universities devoted to this. Well, if you believed, as the communists said, that socialism was the radiant future of all mankind, well, that made a certain amount of sense, I suppose. However, now that we know that that form of socialism, at least, is not the future of mankind, radiant or not, scholars have begun to turn their attention to the foundations of our own civilization, which are liberal foundations, in the sense that I will be explaining. Basically, as Mises outlines in liberalism, the right of private property in the sense of the right to your own body, the right to your own liberty, the right to your own faculties, and the right to what you produce. So, the question then is, everybody is now examining this issue of liberalism, going into its history and so on. Well, what is liberalism? And, incidentally, I want to tell you this. In my talk today and my other talks, for instance, my talk on Keynes, in one of the sessions on later on in the week, I'll be making a lot of statements. And my email address, as the email address of all the instructors, is listed on your program. So, if you have any question about the sources of my statements, then feel free to email me. Or if you have questions about bibliography, feel free to email me, and I'll clue you into what's involved. So then the question is, what is liberalism? And surveying the sources, I could quote many different interpretations. The basic problem is that there is total conceptual mayhem in regard to this idea of liberalism. You find many authors saying, well, we can find out what liberalism is by examining the ideas, and then they list people they consider great liberals, like like Adam Smith, John Locke, Jefferson, but then also John Dewey, John Maynard Keynes, Galbraith, and so on. Well, if you examine the ideas of these people on basic issues, like, for instance, private property, they're in very great conflict. The term liberalist tossed around nowadays. It's very hard to understand what's meant by it. The way that it's used nowadays is really of no use for anybody who wants to examine liberalism historically. And I have a good quote here from Max Weber. Now, Max Weber, of course, was in a way of a liberal. He was a friend of Mises for a while in Vienna, as a matter of fact. Weber. And Max Weber worked a good deal in methodology. And Max Weber, at one point, makes a very important point. He says, the use of the undifferentiated collective concepts of everyday speech, when we're trying to be scientific about it, when we're trying to be historians, of just concepts that are man-in-the-street type concepts, is always a cloak for confusion of thought and action. It is indeed very often an instrument of specious and fraudulent procedures. It is, in brief, always a means of obstructing the proper formulation of the problem. And I think that this holds above all for the concept of liberalism. By the way, let me mention this. You might say, well, why go into a semantic discussion? Why insist on using this term liberalism in something like its authentic historical meaning? Why not just give it up? Well, it's there's a reason the other side insists on using the term liberal. I mean, it's not as if they would give it up and call themselves what they should call themselves, socialists or social democrats or whatever. They insist on calling themselves liberals. Why? Because there's a strong heuristic and polemical weight to the term liberalism. So I'm looking through my notes here, and well, take an example. There's a guy who's written late now, deceased now, but who wrote on liberalism and had a bit of a reputation. A Brazilian named José Mercure, and he says, the meaning of liberalism changed a great deal. Nowadays, what liberal generally means in continental Europe and Latin America is something quite different from what it means in the United States. So first of all, there's some kind of contemporary, simultaneous, geographical differentiation and conflict within this term. Not just historical, but even at the present time, according to this guy. Since Roosevelt's New Deal, American liberalism has acquired a social democratic tinge. Liberalism in the United States has come close to liberal socialism. Well, you could say that also about Europe, about the so-called liberal parties, the British Liberal Party. And the Spectator, admittedly a conservative journal in London, they mock the British Liberal Party as being concerned above all for public funding for transgender operations for the British police. They're certainly not liberal in any historical sense. So maybe he's emphasizing the difference between Europe and America too much. But then he says, on the other hand, the meaning of liberalism in its current revival, he means Hayek and Friedman and so on, both in the United States and elsewhere, has only a tenuous connection with the mainstream U.S. meaning, and often marks a departure from it. You follow what's being said here? Even within the United States now, according to this guy, the use of the term liberal, Friedman insists on calling himself a liberal, Hayek often called himself a liberal, that is a departure from the previous New Deal meaning of liberal. So added confusion to it. Well, what I'm asking is, why don't we look at the historical record and find out what liberalism meant? It doesn't mean that the liberals were right. It doesn't, the classical liberals, that means. It doesn't mean that their social philosophy was the correct one, but let's try to understand what it was. And, well, there are many other confused grapplings with this that could be mentioned. Well, let's go back then and study something about the history of liberalism. One thing about the history of liberalism that's clear. I'm sorry, I forgot to bring a glass, so I'll have to do a rather vulgar thing here. If you don't mind. Thank you. Liberalism is connected intimately and inevitably with the history of Europe. And it's not an accident that liberalism rose within this European context. Now, what this brings up is, well, what is the essence of the European history? What is the essence of the European experience? And here, again, you're going to have to take my word for it, but the bibliography is available for anybody who asks me. It's, by this time, an immense bibliography. And it has to do with the question of what was distinctive about Europe, why did freedom, in the modern sense, arise in Europe, why did economic growth begin in Europe? I say the literature is immense. It includes books by the Nobel laureate Douglas North, who won his Nobel Prize because of his work in economic history. Many other people. There'd be David Landis of Harvard in his book, The Unbound Prometheus. Other Americans, E.L. Jones, an Australian economic historian, Jean Bechler at the University of Paris, Eric Vida at now at the Bonn University, William McNeill at Chicago, an immense literature. They don't agree on everything, but this is the basic idea. what was distinctive about Europe? And as Bachelor and others point out, the way Bachelor puts it, the distinctive thing about, in his Origins of Capitalism, the distinctive thing about Europe was a non-event. The non-event was the failure to arise of any hegemonic empire in Europe after the fall of Rome in the West. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, which is what we consider, Western Europe, Central Europe, no power was able to establish itself as the great hegemon, an imperial power. There was no empire. And the powers that did try to to set up an empire, the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, and then in time to come, the Spanish Habsburgs, Philip II and others, and then Louis XIV and the Bourbon kings of France, and then Napoleon, and then Hitler, and so on. None of them were able to establish a permanent empire in Europe. Instead, Europe became a mosaic from early times, from the Middle Ages, from the early Middle Ages on. Europe became a mosaic of divided jurisdictions, divided and competing jurisdictions. All, however, within a framework of a common civilization. It's not just that they were divided, but they were also bound together by a common civilization, which was Western Christendom. As time went on, different kind of political organizations came into existence. There were kingdoms, there were city-states, there were principalities, there were the different type of religious political organizations, bishoprics, archbishoprics, and so on. And there were hundreds of them at the time of the Middle Ages. Hundreds of them. Now, given that the civilization is very similar, and given that you have this division of political authorities, what results from this? Well, what resulted from this was a possibility which didn't exist in many other places, the possibility of exit. Now, if you read this literature, and these people are not, for the most part, libertarians, but again and again, you come across the assumption that the state power is predatory, that whoever has political power exercises it in order to squeeze as much of society's resources from the people as it can. Okay, this is the assumption, and in all honesty, looking through history, it would be very hard to deny this. However, because of the possibility of exit in Europe, the potential for predatory behavior was relatively limited. And you can see why. Okay? Supposing that you're a merchant in the Persian Empire, a merchant in India, a merchant in China, well, these vast organizations, this vast political, social organization that you live within, it's hard to escape from its clutches. If, on the other hand, you lived in Europe, you were a merchant, let's say you're a merchant in Rotterdam, under the Duke of Burgundy, and the Duke of Burgundy starts to put the tax squeeze on you, or arbitrary confiscations. As a matter of fact, the Dukes of Burgundy were pretty good, and they acted in the opposite direction. But supposing he does, well, as a merchant, you can take yourself, your human capital, as much as your material capital as possible, and you go across the North Sea to England, or you go down the Rhine River to the Archbishopric of Cologne, where very often there'd be rulers who are welcoming productive citizens that they can tax. Not as much as they would have been taxed at home, not this predatory taxation, but still it adds to their tax base. So they welcome then some of these people who would have been otherwise oppressed. And that has to do with the possibility of exit, of leaving an area where the political and economic conditions have become exorbitant, and going not to a totally foreign country, you understand, not to some Islamic country or a Turkish country or something. You'd still be within basically European civilization, and there practicing your trade and exercising your profession. Now, this basic idea was known a long time ago. You can find it in Gibbon when he talks about the Roman Empire. You can find it in Ludwig von Mises. And this is another reason I say we come back to Mises again and again. Mises was not primarily a historian, but when he dealt with important historical issues, he really put his finger on the crucial element. And as he said, what was distinctive about the West is the idea of individual freedom, of the guarantee of life and property against the political authority. And it's a sort of thing that did not exist for very long in many places, and in most places in the East, in other great civilizations. Because you see what happens with this possibility of exit. Well, then to the possibility of exit within the international connection, we have to add also what the situation is within each one of these polities. And there also you have decentralization of power and division of power. Because you had, first of all, a feudal nobility, which was not created by the king, but based on a contract, so that they felt they had their own rights as against the king. And you had an international church. This was a very important part of the whole European scene. Why? Well, look at other civilizations. Politics and religion are two of the most important things that any society has to deal with. And in most great civilizations, the political authority and the religious authority entered into a coalition and entered into a combination to oppress the people. This was, and sometimes the political authority claimed to be the religious authority. The Emperor of China was the high priest of what was considered the Chinese religion. The Emperor of Japan was himself divine. The Pharaoh was a god. So you had a kind of synergistic situation with religion and the political authority helping each other to oppress the people. And sometimes with, even when you had Christianity per se, you had that. You had that in the Byzantine Empire, because the Byzantine emperors controlled the church. You had that in Russia, because the Russian Tsars control the Russian Orthodox Church. So it's not a question of Christianity per se, it's a question of the institution. And in the West, it happened that this Catholic Church came into conflict with the political authorities. And it was international, that it was not bound by one kingdom, let's say, so that the king could totally control it. It had this international backing behind it. And the Catholic Church's claims were universal, were global. Yeah, they said the Pope said he was in control of everything, not the emperor. Well, fortunately, neither one of them won out. And what happened in the course of the conflict of centuries between them, principally with the Holy Roman Emperor, but also then between the Pope and other secular rulers, is that they had to call on the people and give and grant rights to the people in order to get them on their side against the other massive power. Lord Acton, the great liberal historian, describes this process. And from this struggle, and also as an attempt, again going back to this exit question, as an attempt to draw the productive people into your own kingdom, a whole set of institutions arose in medieval Europe that were unique throughout the civilized world. You had representative assemblies, the best known as the Parliament. These representative assemblies are different from our wonderful democratic assemblies today because they represented the taxpayers. And the king had to call together the representatives of the tax-paying classes when he wanted to introduce any new taxes, because a new tax was considered something very strange and unconventional. Also in Europe, you had the proliferation of, the Magna Carta is the best known example. Bills of rights, charters, statements of the inherited traditional rights of the people. Among the most important was not to be taxed without their consent, which meant the consent of the tax-paying classes. You understand what the situation, how different it is today. The way the income tax is evolving in the United States, very soon almost all of the income tax will be paid by a minority of the people. That's what they mean by saying taking the poorest off the tax rolls. Well, they don't have to pay the income tax. Well, the income tax is going to be paid already. Most of it is paid by about 20% of the people, but it'll be paid, all of it, or virtually all, will be paid by a small minority of the people. Then you can imagine what's going to happen to the income tax, how the voting public is going to greet tax cuts. Well, why should they care about tax cuts? They don't pay any taxes. Well, taxation without representation meant that those who actually pay taxes, their representatives have to okay any new taxes. This was the foundation of all of the representative assemblies of the Middle Ages. And the Parliament of England is the best known example, but they existed everywhere in Europe. The Cortes of Castile and Leon, for instance, was older than the Parliament of England. All of the Spanish states, or the Iberian states, had such assemblies. The Italian states also. In Germany, the Diet. In France, the Estates General. In Scandinavia. In the Low Countries, the Diets of the various provinces of what afterwards became the Netherlands and Belgium. Everywhere. And also there were these statements, Magna Carta, for instance, but elsewhere, where the prince, on ascending to the throne, the old king dies, the new king comes in, he has to swear to this list of rights that the people have. And above all, having to do with taxation. We're not going to introduce any new taxes without the Diet's okay, and we're not going to change the customs of the people. So, that existed also. That came out of medieval Europe also. And then together with that went what you could call an ideology, or let's say a discourse. And that was the discourse of natural law. Not yet natural rights in the more modern sense, but natural law. And it was taught in the universities. It was part of the scholastic philosophy, taught from Oxford to Salamanca to the Charles University in Prague, that the king is under the law. No prince is above the law. The idea of the late Roman Empire, that what the prince says makes law. The idea of the Third Reich. Hitler's order on the phone supersedes anything, any German law or the German Constitution. Okay? This is pure despotism. Well, that was what was denied by natural law. The idea that the prince rules not for his own sake and his own glory, but for the good of the people. So you had this natural law discourse, which of course has roots in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that was universally taught. This was the situation in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages, let's say in the 15th century. Now, what happens in the next, an important part of the whole development, and in a way, I've already indicated some part of it, is that free towns, free cities arose in Europe. The best known are the ones in northern Italy, central Italy, but everywhere in Europe, especially the Low Countries, northern France, along the Rhine, dozens and dozens of German towns, which had their own charters, which meant, again, these were guaranteed rights of the citizens of this town. And no one, no feudal lord, no ruler could infringe on these rights. They were not universal rights, they were not the rights of man, but they were the guaranteed traditional rights of the people who lived in that area. And what came out of Europe, again, as far as I can see, unique. I don't know, it may be that in Japan one could find parallels. But you had the creation of a self-confident, self-assured, in many ways self-governing middle class of merchants, of bankers, of manufacturers. They were in charge of the towns, by the way. And the leftists want to say, well, poor proletarians, they weren't in charge of the towns and so on. Well, precisely because you had this middle class in charge of the towns, you had the kind of guarantees for property which allowed for economic growth. And this bourgeoisie, if you want to call it, this affluent and self-confident middle class, this was the incubator, the nursery of a basic independent attitude that then blossomed into what we call liberalism. Okay. I'll have to. The history of liberalism is rich in individuals and events. One group that has gained more attention recently, and you can find it very well discussed in Murray Rothbard's, the first volume of Murray Rothbard's History of Economic Thought, sometimes called the School of Salamanca, after a great university in Spain, but not all of the members belong to it. So that we can call them the Spanish scholastics, or again, they weren't all Spaniards, there were a few Portuguese, but basically Spanish scholastics, the late scholastics. These were thinkers who were all clerics, monks and priests, and who developed scholastic philosophy, including ethics. But now, in the 16th century and going into the early 17th century, since Spain had become such a commercial center, more and more concerning themselves with economics. And for a long time, it was thought that these people just mechanically applied ethical ideas to economics to the detriment of economics. They talked about the just price. Well, what it turns out is that when they talked about the just price and analyzed it, the just price turns out to be the competitive market price. And in one area after another, taxes, prices, Maria draws on other people's research and sets this forth, and especially on the deleterious effects of taxation and of government controls. These priests and monks did a lot of good work. Oh, and what Murray finds and others have found especially important about these Iberian scholastics is their utility theory. This is, I guess you would say, the beginning of the continental theory of economic value based on utility. Different from the later confused and very damaging theory developed by the British classical writers, especially Ricardo, where labor is based on, where economic value is based on labor. And this develops eventually into the Marxist labor theory of value. From these Spanish writers, you have a line that goes through Italian writers and then also French writers of the 18th century and then the 19th century that is much closer to the Austrian point of view than the famous British classical writers. Okay, so what happens then to this Europe of guaranteed rights, guaranteed traditional, limited rights, of representative assemblies, of natural law? Well, in the 15th century and on, the kings begin to consolidate their power. For various reasons, the church declines in influence, the nobility declines in influence, the kings are able to co-opt the cities, bring the towns under their control, and in the great monarchies of Europe, especially in France and in Spain and in the Austrian lands, the age of absolutism, what we call the age of absolutism, comes about. What this involves is the centralization of power. Remember, the whole point of Europe was that power was decentralized. Now the centralization of power in royal bureaucracies in the capital, economic power through regulation, political power, and since these representative assemblies almost everywhere go out of existence, become ciphers, taxation increases. The limits that had existed on the power of the rulers, the institutional limits, now begin to disappear. And it looks as if this is the wave of the future. This is the way it's going to be. This looks like the modern way of doing things, except that there was a reaction against it, and in two places. The first was in Holland, or what we call Holland or the Netherlands. There the Spanish Habsburgs try to bring in taxes which were not okayed by the different diets, simply on the say-so of the Spanish kings. See, that was territory that they owned, what we call Netherlands and Belgium. And also to bring in the Inquisition to stamp out the new Protestant heresy. So the Dutch revolted. And it's one of the great landmarks of modern history, the struggle of the Dutch people against Spanish tyranny. I don't know how many people have heard about this. Has anybody among Americans, Europeans, probably more than Americans? Because after all, if you're devoting your time to talking about Harriet Tubman and this guy who invented the peanut and so on, there's often not enough time to deal with something like this. But it's a key struggle because the Europe that was still divided, still decentralized in the sense that there are different kingdoms and so on. There, the Dutch revolt could succeed. Say if you were in China or something and some province revolted, well, the whole empire would come down on them. Here, the Dutch made their alliances with Elizabeth of England and others, and they were able to succeed. And Holland became the first Wirtschaftswunder, the first economic miracle in the history of Europe, and now we're beginning the story of European economic growth, because there was no king, there was no court, there was a central diet, except that there's a little Congress or Parliament, except that they were bound by what their provincial diets told them. In Holland, in Haarlem, Zeeland, and all the other little provinces. So in other words, there was almost no central government. There were about 2/3 of the people Protestant, about 1/3 Catholic, so that the Protestants could have decided to try to exterminate the Catholics, but as the line keeps going through Godfather 1, I don't know if you remember that, it would have been bad for business. They could have set up auto da fes the way they had in Spain, burning people at the stake, but that certainly is bad for business. I mean, you go to a mall and you hear screams of Catholics being burned, and I'm sure that the profit margins would go down. So, from self-interest, mainly, you had a de facto toleration. The Dutch printers were concerned above all, well, I don't want to make invidious comments about national types, except that there was a general joke in Europe: how do you get a dozen Dutchmen into a VW? You throw in a 5-mark piece. So we have a people here that is basically a mercantile people, really. They're business oriented. And of course, tremendous Philistines, because all businessmen are total Philistines, right? Haters of the arts, and so on, right? The Dutch never did anything in the way of painting, too bad. The paintings used to be sold next to the herring barrels. It was a very commercial society, and it had certain advantages. Let me quote here from a man whose ancestors came to Holland, the great Jewish philosopher Spinoza, from Amsterdam. very proud of his city. The city of Amsterdam, Spinoza said, reaps the fruit of this freedom in its own great prosperity and in the admiration of other people. For in this most flourishing state and most splendid city, men of every nation and religion live together in the greatest harmony and ask no questions before trusting their goods to a fellow citizen, save whether he be rich or poor, and whether he generally acts honestly or the reverse. Spinoza was a member of this great Jewish community of Amsterdam that existed there until the time of Anne Frank. And this is an example of the tolerance of the Dutch also. So, as he says, the admiration of everyone else. People noticed what was happening in Holland. Of course, there were poor in Holland. The poor in Holland were taken better care of than the poor anywhere else in Europe, by very local charities and religious organizations and so on. So you had it. So, and why then did you have this Dutch miracle? Toleration, certainly, but toleration was part of a complex, and the complex had to do with private property. It was a polity, a society run by merchants. The Calvinist ministers, whenever they could, would try to get in and have laws outlawing the Catholics and so on. The merchants outvoted them. Now, the merchants, more than anything else, are concerned with the right to property and the rule of law. The rule of law, if you have arbitrary police action all the time, this is bad for business also. Business doesn't like unpredictability of that kind. And rule of property, well, let me give you an example which maybe some of you probably could imagine on your own, but it makes the point. If you think of the Arabian Nights and other stories having to do with the East, where is the treasures? Where are the treasures located? Okay, I have to do what I did in the seminar last night. $50 for the first person who answers. Very good. Ask Professor Reisman for a check later. Right. There's gold, there's silver, there's diamonds, everything in this cave that's guarded by king cobras and so on. Right? Why is the wealth of these rich people in this cave? Because it makes a good story? Because if he brought it out, it would be seized, right? Either by the Sultan or by the local head of the garrison, who has the weapons, who has the army, who's in physical control. So whoever has wealth hides it. And I could give you sources for this. Francois Bernier was a French physician who visited India and Persia and the lands of the East in the 17th century, and he spoke about this in great detail. Okay, so that's the East, and it's a simplification. However, that is the basic truth about many parts of the East: the insecurity of property. In Holland, and this is not Max Weber's idea of the Protestant ethic. Even before the Protestant Reformation, they sent out fishing boats for the herring harvest, where the herring was caught by the thousands. It was gutted, it was salted, and put into boxes, into crates on the boat, and it was ready for transshipment once they got back to Amsterdam or Rotterdam. Okay, there's wealth in action. Why do the people who own that boat and the herring fleet not worry about its being seized? Why don't they take their wealth and put it into some hole in the ground? Because there's an absolute guarantee of property. Because they and their friends are making the laws. It's not the people who want to take other people's property who make the laws, and as in present-day democracy, but actually the taxpayers and the wealth holders who are making the laws, so property is secure. You know, the modern culture and modern mentality is such, I can see this in my students, that when I say something like, you know, there was some guy who owned this herring boat and he made made a big profit over it, the first thing that comes into their mind is, well, why not take the boat away from him and then divide it up among the needy? Right? Whenever you hear something like property owners or accumulation of property, the idea is somehow, well, that really should be used for more needy people. If that had been done from the beginning, as Camille Paglia says in another connection, then we'd still be living in grass huts. What made capital accumulation possible was, where it happened, the guarantee of property rights. And this Europe had much better, and in some parts of Europe, much better than other parts of the world. So this is the Dutch experience at the end of the 16th century, early 17th century, and then we have the second blow against the new absolutism, and that was in England, where a dynasty comes to power, the Stuart kings, who say, get rid of all these old-fashioned medieval Gothic type limitations on royal power. We read Machiavelli, we read the modern authors. The king must have absolute power. And the hell with the British tradition, the hell with the Magna Carta, and so on. And also the hell with any kind of limitation from Parliament when we think that we need to impose new taxes. This begins decades of constitutional struggles, which maybe you've heard of, and this more than the Dutch probably, but it is one of the key events of world history. And that's why in the older times there'd be whole courses in American universities on England in the 17th century. This was a titanic struggle. This was a struggle between the Stuart kings on the one hand and the representatives of Parliament and the limitations on the power of the kings on the other. And in the end, by the end of the century, one British king had been beheaded, one British king had been deposed and thrown out, and you had the rule of Parliament, which was not a libertarian rule, which was not a free market rule, but nonetheless represented a victory of the forces of limitation of royal prerogative against against the forces that wanted unlimited royal power. Now, Holland produced some thinkers. I don't read Dutch, so it's hard to know what to make of them, but don't seem to be particularly important in the history of liberalism. Much different in England, which already had a very deep tradition of political thought and political discourse. And in the course of the 17th century, now you can see for the first time what we call liberalism coming into existence. The first group was a movement called the Levelers. In the middle of the century. John Lilburn was their leader. And they were radical for their times. Total separation of state and church. No more tithes. No more Church of England exploiting the people of England. The end of royal monopolies. And as Professor De Lorenzo pointed out the other day, monopoly meant a royal grant to some group of privileged capitalists. You're the only ones who have the right to trade with the Levant or with the East Indies. You're the only ones who have the right to manufacture playing cards or starch or whatever. The Levelers demanded the end of that. Reduced taxes against British imperialism in favor of the rights of the Magna Carta. And they even went so far as to say that we should not, it's not such a good idea or very nice to try to exterminate the Irish. Whatever you might feel about that, but that was their point of view. They didn't win. They were just a small group. Nonetheless, their ideas continued in England into the 18th century. Much better known and more influential was the philosopher of the Glorious Revolution later in the century, the great John Locke. Now, This is the beginning of the great tradition of the English-speaking people of liberalism. It's interesting to note with the levelers fought against two major groups. On the one hand, the wealthy capitalists and others who had connections with the court and wanted and sought and achieved these monopolies, imperialism, the slave trade, everything connected with the government. On the other hand, they fought against the groups below them, you might say, in the social scale, who had nothing to lose, had no property, so were in favor of equal distribution, of social revolution, and so on. In other words, what you had there was the middle classes, the industrious middle classes. And they have always been the carrier of classical liberal ideas among the English, among the other English-speaking people around the world, and among the Americans. So that you had a kind of social basis for this philosophy. A lot more could be said. I'm going to be talking about the tradition of American libertarianism in one of our sessions tomorrow. I'm afraid that I don't have too much time to develop this. This is, in a way, you might say, the prehistory of liberalism then. But I'd like to spend a few minutes, we have a few minutes left, answering questions or entertaining comments that you might have. Thank you. Now, as I interpret that, you're applauding because I've said, well, I'm finished, now you start to talk. Is that what's happening here? Comments, questions? Anybody? Yes, Sean.
The Dutch as being one of the first, like Amsterdam being one of the first places to have a true capitalist society ruled by the ruling class being merchants and so on and so forth.
Uh-huh.
Was that pre or was that before or after John Locke?
No, that's John Locke writes his two treatises of government published in 1689, 1690. So no, we're talking about the end of about a century before. Yeah. And in fact, Locke, since he was on the outs with the authorities and the Stuart kings, went into exile in Holland and spent years in exile there, so that the Dutch community was well known to him. See, this is what liberalism doesn't come full blown out of the mind of anybody. It develops from one thinker to another, and it develops very often as a distillation of observed social reality. Some thinker like Locke will see in Dutch society seems to work quite well with toleration. In England, the authorities, the Church of England tells us everybody has to believe the same thing or society will fall to pieces. But in Holland, you have Jews, you have all kinds of Protestants, you even have Catholics if they don't make too much to do about it. And it works. It functions. So now, I'm not saying that what Locke, he has some important letters on toleration, John Locke, that this is a simple reflection of social reality. But it's provoked by social reality. He reflects upon it. He distills a theory from it. And then, when the time came for Jefferson to write about toleration in the colony of Virginia and the Bill of Rights of the United States, he says we start with Jefferson, we start with John Locke, but then we go beyond him. That is, now, for instance, we can give toleration to Catholics, which John Locke refused to do. So you have that kind of evolution. And let me make this general statement. This is what I believe liberalism is. This is classical liberalism is. Classical liberalism is based on the doctrine that within the wide bounds of individual rights, it could be flexible from one thinker to another, but very wide bounds of individual rights, society runs itself. Society doesn't need some authorities to tell people what to believe in religion, how to pursue cultural interests, their family life, what they should think about their neighbors, what they should think about other races, the relations between men and women. And a society doesn't need other people to control the economy. See, that's a whole specialized branch of liberalism, economic liberalism, based on economic ideas such as the doctrine of the Austrian school. Somebody want to say something else or some questions? Yes.
Did the Reformation play a significant role in the decentralization of political power?
No, well, in a way. The Reformation played a different role in different countries. In England, the Church of England was set up, and if the Church of England had continued its effective monopoly, then things would have been very bad. But very soon, dissenting sects, smaller Protestant sects came into existence. The Congregationalists, the Baptists, after a while the Methodists, the Quakers, and so on. And they tended to be anti-state because they were all subjected to the tithe of the Church of England. So a large proportion of the great English classical liberals came out of these dissenting, non-Church of England Protestant groups. In other places, however, with the destruction of the international Catholic Church, the Church fell under the control of the prince in the German states, for instance. That is, whoever was in control of the state did become appointed all the bishops. So he controlled the church. There had been an idea that somehow Luther's every man his own priest is a summation of individualism. Not really. Luther believed every man could be his own priest, but naturally any healthy, sane, decent person would come up with the same religious ideas as Luther. And if not, he should be persecuted. So I don't think that the Reformation is a landmark in liberalism, much less the Renaissance.
What about the old historians? They disregard commerce altogether. They would consider commerce as a significant change in history.
I'm sorry, I couldn't make out what you were saying.
The old historians in making history that they disregard commerce altogether.
You say Roman historians?
Historians.
Well, some historians disregard commerce except good historians, of course economic historians, but good historians bring in the economic life of society. In general, historians don't share as much as others, let's say people in literature, this disdain for commerce and the world of economic affairs that so many intellectuals and academics have, as if somehow it's beneath them. Somebody was at our seminar last night was asking, how is it that these bad ideas proliferate so much? How come we hear about them all the time? They're practically the dominant ideas. Well, I think a large part of that has to do with the constant influence of academics, you see, I have a subversion in our very midst. This influence of academics has to do with their, as Mises pointed out in one of his very interesting essays, The Psychological Roots of the Hostility to Economic Doctrine, has to do with the way of life of these academics. The way of life of these academics is, sure, why not? Everybody should be able to live from a government check. Even the ones who don't come from state schools, they live from some endowment, So we all live from checks. They have no idea of the market. They have no idea of the life of business people, where you live and die by the ups and downs of the market. You have to be an entrepreneur. They live like the old Chinese mandarins, professors nowadays. So they have the disdain for business people. Business people, what the hell do they know? They can't deconstruct William Blake, for instance. They don't know as much as we do. And by the way, let me mention this also. The term intellectual is very misleading because it makes you think that somehow intellectuals are brighter than other people. Not so. What intellectuals mostly have is control of a discourse, is mastery of a discourse. Well, I don't know how it is at your school, but not only at my school, but many of the academics that I've met are not on the level of a competent middle kind of business person. They just don't have the smarts. Well, they can talk. They have words. They're very good at that. If they could, like the clergy of so many different cultures, they talk in a different language, so nobody could even understand them. So they would be even more mysterious. Okay, any other questions? Yes, back there.
As your graduate class in liberalism, and it seems they had a great skepticism of joint stock companies and corporations. Was this because of the tendencies of these big businesses to abuse government power by getting subsidies, or was this because the class of liberals seemed to be skeptical of high concentration?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I know that there have been writers who have been critical of corporations because of the limited liability, but I don't think that's a real problem. I mean, a firm gets together and says, we limit our liability to the joint funds of the firm and none of our private firms. Anybody who wants to deal with us, suppliers, customers, and so on, you understand what the terms are. So that I don't see that's a problem. I'm not sure what to say about that. Who do you have in mind? Do you have anybody in mind? Against joint stock companies. I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know why that would be.